After all this kind of cruising around and then the Plympton practice wasn't available and there were no other practices and what we were going to do, there were in fact one or two other little short-term locums that kept a bit of food money coming in at that stage. But then by word of mouth we heard that my predecessor in this Mungavin surgery had suddenly died, Lyle Bruce. Interestingly, although I know a lot about him and I can almost hear his voice in my head, I never met him. We had a long association with his widow, Marion Bruce, who's a well-known identity for many years before and after. She was on board member of the old Wellington Area Health Board and involved with Intellectual Handicap Society, IHC, and various other things. They had a son with quite severe autism. Her obituary was just last year. She died at about 90-something, and she was a real pioneer in support and care for autistic individuals.
She would never sell us the building.
No.
Because the rent paid for him to be at Hohepa.
Yeah, went to a family trust to look after their boy.
Yeah. And we paid quite exorbitant rent for this awful little building. But moving was always too expensive thing to contemplate. We looked at a house just up Mungavin Avenue, but by then the rules the council put on converting it and providing parking were just mad. Yeah. And we thought, no, that's too scary to contemplate.
Lyle Bruce and his wife, I mean, she probably had a similarly isolating time too in their previous location, because he'd worked in Patia for about 10 years before he came down here, so that's another,
But she liked that better than Porirua.
She did, yeah, that's
felt
true.
Quite uprooted, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And the big freezing works at Patia was its heyday then, so it was quite a lively and well-nourished town, you might say, not like the subsequent days. So Lyle Bruce was one of the old guard. The little building there had been a doctor's surgery, as far as I know, from just about after World War II. His predecessor there was one of the Ongley family. Can't remember a Christian name or an initial.
He was a neighbour who backed on to this property. It was up on Arafat Street.
Ongley is a famous medical family, and there were a couple of Ongley doctors in Wellington, and this was a brother or a cousin or something out here as well, who started off, as I understand it, in one of the early houses just a bit further up Mungavin Avenue, sort of up almost at the Seavers Grove level. And then as the little shopping centre down here in Rānui developed in the late 50s, early 60s, so the shops started to appear there. This building, he either built it or it was built by somebody and he occupied it. So from the 1950s, that was a medical clinic. And Lyle Bruce took it over from him, but Lyle and his wife Marion lived over in Elston. They had quite a prominent, of its type, two-storied house in Prussing Street, just opposite Mana College. And he also built a tiny little wee clinic attached to their house as well. And then he dropped dead of his second heart attack. A lot of people would say, well, the town worked him to death, but I think he probably was prone to it because some of the other colleagues of his of the same era worked just as hard. They would see 80 or 90 patients a day, and the patients didn't sit down. They were whisked through like a conveyor belt, and that's because of the need, and they didn't have too much choice, really.
The first day that Larry started there, he had to teach everyone to sit down. They'd come in with the practice nurse who'd tell Larry everything she thought he needed to know. And they'd come in and they'd stand there and Larry'd say, oh no, Dr. Bruce didn't let us sit down, and not shut the door either, because all that took time. And that's
what I mean by the sort of hearing his voice in my head. He was shortish fellow, with a bit of a bristly beard, and as far as I can sort of absorb the character of the man, a bit irascible. I did see him on television once, actually. There was a panel. It was all about the 80 patients a day and how terrible it was on the frontier out in this extraordinary place. Yeah, I think it was Brian Edwards interviewed this panel, and there were about sort of a dozen people in the TV studio, and there was Lyle Bruce in the front row ranting away.
There was a great big sign we took down that said, "Don't ask us to call a taxi if you haven't paid the bill."
And the patients used to say that he'd step out of his consulting room, and we wouldn't come right into the waiting room, he'd stand in the hallway and say, "Next victim!"
everybody who was in the waiting room could hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
The discussion.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, our practice nurse would openly come out and say, have you been taking whatever? And then, well, if you haven't, do you expect to be better? And the patients were used to sitting in the waiting room and being very open about their complaints, however intimate they were, it didn't matter. So everybody was just privy to everything that went on. There was no real privacy, was there? We had to teach them that they were allowed to be private and have secrets. But they'd come in and they'd say, I've been down the fanny clinic, Anna. And quite a lot of the younger girls had various diseases. And they were completely open about it, you know. And they'd sit there going, yeah, I've been down the fanny clinic. I haven't had it this year, so I've had a few months without.
Indeed.
Yeah, they were hilarious. They were so open, weren't they?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What were the kind of illnesses? You know, were they related to work? But clearly they were related
Well,
to something
some of these
else.
were working girls, you understand.
Yes, I do.
Bit of a mixture. Lots of infectious disease. You know, people getting bronchitis and respiratory illness and so forth. I mean, there's some similarities even now, I guess. You know, the car workers getting gout from too much beer down at the bottom tavern, injuries from weekend fights, the usual fun mix of stuff.
That's right. A lot of sadly hard to breathe people sitting.
Yeah.
You know, you'd often, when it was cold in the winter, all you could hear.
Asthma was a big thing. I mean, it still
huge.
is pretty significant, but back then it was way worse.
Well,
Asthma
you think
was
how
scary.
often you had to get the nebulizer out? It would
Well,
virtually
yeah.
be running non-stop.
I mean, those are the days when we used, you know, intravenous aminophylline, and people's homes were just dangerous stuff. And
Yeah.
just
Because of the housing conditions and the work conditions
smoking.
and the smoking.
all of that, yeah. I mean, there's probably some other imponderables in there as well. You know, the researchers still can't tell us why it was worse then than it is now, because I'm not sure that the houses are that much better now.
No.
But yeah, that was pretty memorable and hairy. So Library struck dead.
Yeah.
Word of mouth.
Well, Marion had been talking to Jean Bryce.
That's right. It was because I'd been sniffing around the Plimerton practice, and they said, no, we're not ready. But when Marion spoke to Jean, and they were great friends, Jean said, there's this Dr.
Young.
Larry Jordan who's looking for a place, perhaps you should call him. And so it came about. And it was fairly short, sharp, quick negotiation.
And I said, I don't want to leave our house. We had a gorgeous little house in Wadestown.
A little cottage.
And Matthias had started school, and there was this gorgeous little community we were part of. I don't want to move out there. And Larry said, well, if I'm delivering babies, there's no choice. Can't do it from here. So we moved to Plimerton first, didn't we?
Bless you, that's right, yes. That was when we bought at the beach.
Yes.
Yes. So moving back to Porirua after another couple of years in at Wadestown, we bought this interestingly and prominently located place right on the beach, right on South Beach at Plimerton, just in behind the shops there. It was fairly run down and needed lots of work, and we did lots of work on it in the 5 years or so that we were there. And then I started working in the Mungivan practice, and at that stage there was a bit of a mix still of the old guard. So across the road, also in Lower Mungan Avenue, was the practice which is still in its original location now as Oratoa Clinic, and that was run back then in the 70s and 80s by the famous or infamous Dick Graham, who's a well-known character, and lots of the older people around Porirua will remember Dick Graham. He was in a wheelchair. He'd had polio as a young man and trained as a doctor in his middle life. I think he was in his late 30s or 40s when he trained in medicine. He'd done all sorts of other things previously, including being a qualified pilot, and he was a master mariner as well. He was also always heavily into boats. Then trained in medicine, and he was a hard doer. He was a hard drinking, hard swearing. You know, he would be right at home with the guys from Todd Park.
Yeah. He didn't like Larry.
Well, he was sort of mixed feelings really, a bit suspicious. But he did try hard to get me drunk one day on his favourite tipple, which was gin, and he nearly succeeded. He was there for about another 10 years after we were there before he finally retired, and he sold his practice to Anna Gunwadne, lovely Sri Lankan doctor who we were good pals with. And Anna's still working part-time these days at Orotoa. And over in Tatahi Bay, there was Alan Smith and Ted Gray, still part of the old school. And in that first decade that we were here, those practices then transferred as well. Phil White, who'd been a classmate of mine about the same age as me, bought the Alan Smith practice, and he stayed there for a little while and then moved on. John Rowland bought Ted Gray. Well, he didn't so much buy Ted Gray's practice as Ted Gray's practice just kind of dispersed, and John Rowland built the new Tatahi Bay Medical Centre from scratch around in White House Road. So that kind of completed, if you like, a sort of a generational change of doctors in the areas, really. In that 1980s up to about 1986, there was just a big change. All the old guard were gone, and a whole bunch of doctors roughly the same age all came in, and then we all lasted for about another 30 odd years subsequently.